where is most low-end immigrant labor concentrated in terms of industry?
Well, it's in low wage industries, and so it's in the personal service sector, and whether you're thinking about food service, landscaping, lawn care, personal services, concentrated in agriculture, obviously concentrated in the lower end of the construction market. And you see this in the data. We have very good data on what share of the workforce in any given industry or occupation is native born versus foreign born. And down at that very low end of the labor market, jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year, you have upwards of 30%. Probably about a third of the entire workforce is immigrant workers. And again, I think that probably wildly undercounts because
of illegal labor.
And some illegal immigrants will show up in that data, but they are, relatively speaking, less likely to report and be captured by it. By contrast, in the middle to upper end of the labor market, you see more like 15, 16%. So the concentration is twice as high in that low wage side. And I think, again, once you account for illegal immigration, probably closer to 3 times as high.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a variety of distortive effects this tends to have, but one of the ones that I find most interesting, because it goes to some of the lies that are made at the higher end of the immigration spectrum as well, is the distortive effect that mass immigration has on innovation itself. Walk me through what the argument there is in places like the agricultural sector or construction or anything else that's very labor intensive, very hand intensive right now.
Well, so I think there are 2 pieces to the argument. The first is just to understand directly the effect on wages. And I think you nicely teed this up at the start of the discussion. Labor markets do follow the logic of supply and demand. And what that means is when you have fewer workers available and have to pay more to attract the workers you need, you will tend to offer higher wages. Again, you wouldn't think that that's an especially strange or controversial thing to say. I would actually go a step further, though, and say that is, in fact, the only condition under which wages rise, right? An employer, at the margins, you might have employers who, just because they are concerned about their workers, are looking to ensure that they can support a family and so forth. But in the center of the labor market, where you have profit maximizing firms, under what conditions would firms be willing to offer higher wages? It has nothing to do with how much great work the worker is doing. It is if they cannot get the worker unless they offer the higher wage. Yeah. And so that dynamic, are there enough workers available at a lower wage, or do you have to offer a higher wage, is the core of what dictates the trajectory of wages over time. The second piece, then, to your point about innovation, is if you are an employer, the question is, do you want to invest in raising productivity? Now, all things equal, is more productivity good for you as a firm? Yes, probably, but it also has costs. And so if you think about making the kinds of investments you're going to need to raise productivity, whether that is in recruiting and training, whether that is in bringing in more equipment, so more capital investment, it will only make sense to do those things if that is less expensive than just adding more workers. And so it's at that margin where you say, okay, let's talk about agriculture. We want to pick more crops. Well, we have a choice. We can either just hire more people, or we can invest in the people we have being better at crop picking, giving them more advanced equipment to use, et cetera. And that's the trade-off that everyone is always facing in any industry. And when actually there's an unlimited pool of low-wage workers available to you is your reality, you are overwhelmingly going to choose that. And then what our government, of course, does that makes it even worse is if you get to that point where those workers aren't available, you would think that that would be the moment where you would get serious about investing. That is how markets are supposed to work. But instead, for some reason in America, we say, please just raise your hand and say, quote, jobs Americans won't do. And then we'll create a program for you. So we have this agricultural guest worker program, H-2A, which it's actually quite recent. I mean, in 2005, we had about 50,000 workers coming in each year through this visa program. Now it's more than 250,000.
Wow.
And so even where and this goes to this core labor shortage concept, even where there really were not workers available, for some reason, the response of our policymakers is to say, well, the way to solve this problem is more workers, even though that's, of course, exactly the opposite of what anyone actually committed to free markets should actually want to see happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the jobs Americans won't do cliche is one of the most frustrating things in our immigration discourse. Can you talk a little bit about what your research has evidenced about how true that is? Like, are there truly industries like agriculture, maybe heavy manufacturing, et cetera, that there just doesn't seem to be interest in, American citizens in doing?
So yes and no. And I think this is exactly the crux of the problem conceptually. And this is, our project on this, we called it Jobs Americans Would Do.
Yeah.
And we start with this hypothetical, which I've become increasingly fascinated by over the past few years, which is thinking about some tech bro in San Francisco who's, he's driving down to LA for a conference, probably a Bitcoin conference, if I were to guess. He's looking out the window and he's noticing all of these, farm workers laboring away in the fields for $15 an hour. And he's pissed with the real estate prices in San Francisco and these developers who are demanding $60, $70 an hour. And he thinks, well, that's great. I'm going to move my software development firm to, Fresno, and I'm going to set up some crates in a dusty field, and I'm going to pay developers $15 an hour to sit in a hot field and write code for me. This solves all my problems. And so he goes and he does that, and nobody will work for him. And he's really frustrated by this. And, maybe every now and then someone applies but doesn't actually know how to program. And so he calls this a skills gap. And he is looking for sympathy. He says, I look at this, I have a job Americans won't do. And he is, of course, correct. But in that context, our response to him would be like, you are obviously an idiot and, one of the worst business people we have ever seen. We wouldn't say like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, how do we solve this problem and find people to program for him at $15 an hour? And yet his neighbor, who is trying to grow lettuce that way, we say, well, clearly this is a job Americans won't do. The reality is that there aren't a lot of Americans who want to sort of do, really difficult labor in a hot field with with poor treatment and no prospect of progress in a career, in any occupation. And yet we have, for some reason, this concept that certain occupations just should be that kind of job and other occupations shouldn't. And the funny thing about it is that, the only thing that is inherent to the nature of the occupation really is what process you are involved in, right? Even the actual activity is highly mediated by technology. So whether picking lettuce means, maintaining a really advanced machine and operating it and so forth, or bending over picking lettuce, it depends. Conversely, optimizing social media ad targeting to sell more underwear, I don't know, that's not an especially inspiring thing to be doing. And so it seems to me that if we actually step back and look at what are the things we get done in the economy? What are the kinds of processes and projects people would want to be involved in? There's no reason that growing the country's food or building its cars or its houses wouldn't be jobs Americans would rather do as opposed to optimizing its underwear ads or, conducting high frequency trading schemes. So I just reject the construct. And when people say oh, but what can you do? It's just picking lists. Well, I don't know. If you actually had to grow our food in a way that Americans wanted to participate in the project of doing that, this is what markets are for.